Standing army.
I mean, originally, as we'll talk about in this class, that's what the police started as. I mean, the police were, each individual state didn't really have a police force in the 1820s, 30s, 40s. They had militias, and the militia system either fed into what would eventually become the police, or in the South, many police officers weren't really police. They were slave catchers who operated as essential pseudo-militias, pseudo-social controls. It wasn't organized police for most of American history. America didn't do well without it, but this hyper-organized police is its own problem. Right. As always, the best answer is found somewhere in the middle. How you doing, pal? Doing all right.
COVID test came back negative.
That's good. I just had another one this morning. That's my third test. I'm just figuring as long as I'm exposed to y'all, I should be tested weekly. Too many of you.
I'm surprised I didn't die from your last class.
Ugh.
I can't remember who it was, but they sat right there and they brought in food every day.
Doesn't it feel like we just it's like I can't even remember what it was like before COVID sometimes. I mean, I was watching a movie the other day. There were like a whole bunch of people gathered, and I was thinking, like, watching the movie, hey guys, put on masks. This movie's from like 1996. Like, Sarah Michelle Gellar does not need to wear a mask right now. This is 25 years ago. It's a weird world. Sometimes you get that feeling as I'm walking around about like, why the hell do I have to be alive during this mess? Like, give me some other mess that wasn't quite as big in comparison. It's that Lord of the Rings quote. So do all who live to see such times.
Not a bad quote for nowadays.
No, it didn't. Great movie too. Great books. Oh, that was actually one of my summer reading projects. Is I reread the Silmarillion.
If you could go back in time and not have to worry about the physical thing, do you have a time period you'd like?
So I get to pick my social class. It's always my responsibility. Yes, 100%. I'd switch to the Roman, either late Roman Republic. Wouldn't mind being Egyptian royalty either. Yeah. Basic answer is if you get to pick your social class, hell yes. Otherwise, no thank you. If it's like a random, like you spin the wheel, and you get like European peasant 1200, no thank you. But if it's like you get to spin the wheel and it's like, oh well, Egyptian pharaoh, Roman senator, Chinese dynast, like sure, spin my wheel there, that's fine. Otherwise, no.
Yeah, you're a serf in the 17th.
Everybody thinks that they go back in time, they get to be the hero. No, most of the time you go back and you're like run over by a cavalryman 5 minutes into it, like, who the hell is that guy? Have you ever seen the movie, have any of y'all ever seen the movie Timeline? It's a good, okay, it's an old Michael Crichton. Michael Crichton. And it's about like these archaeologists who are digging at this like space in France. They're digging up a site from the 100 Years' War. And they are working, and one of the guys in the thing disappears. And like one of the archaeologists disappears, and they find out he had been working for a company that had been working on sending objects back and forth. What they were trying to do is find a new way to get like deliver mail or something crazy, like shooting it from New York City to Los Angeles via like some sort of science. I don't know. I mean, you know, I don't understand these things. Anyways, what they find out is they're not sending it from place to place. They're accidentally sending these objects over and over and over again to this exact same place in time in history during a battle of the 100 Years' War. And so they find out they accidentally sent one of the archaeologists back in time. And so this is how like the whole story is how they go get him, or if they can get him.
What all did they send back then?
So they sent like a package to see if it could be done, because that's what they were trying to do.
These guys are digging it up.
So essentially what happens is the company and the archaeologists are doing two different things.
Yeah.
And the company keeps sending these objects, and they keep never showing up. They disappear from the machine, but they never show up. So eventually they send a camera back to the 1300s. And the camera is something that they can like maneuver or something like that. And they find that the objects keep coming back to the same spot. They go somewhere for X number of days, then they show back up in the machine. And so they piece together, based on the camera keeps taking photos of the night sky, and they piece together that it's sending them to like 1370 or something like that. They use more science and math that I don't understand to link where they are, and eventually they start sending people back. And that's when the story kind of picks up, essentially. Timeline. It's a movie with a young Gerard Butler. Who's the guy from Paul Walker?
You're back there.
Back there. Paul Walker.
No,
Fast and Furious fame. It's a good little action sci-fi romp. Nothing we would call serious science.
Another good one is Parallels, which is a
Never seen
building that you go. So there's this building that appears in every single timeline, right?
Uh-huh.
You go into it, it looks like it's the exact same every time. You go into it, after a few seconds, if you walk out the front doors, you're still in the present, but it's another timeline. Like suppose you could end up on July 31st, 2020, but in this reality, it's more technologically advanced. Or post-apocalyptic.
Interesting. Like kind of like parallel universes.
Yes, yeah, alternate timelines universe.
Interesting.
Okay.
That was kind of the central conceit of this movie was essentially that you weren't really being sent to this time like a copy of you was being sent, like a photocopy. It was a very interesting take on it. Frankly, it was kind of a terrifying take on it because it made some sense. So essentially, when you're sent, the body has to react to time travel because you're literally like, it's taking you apart at a genetic level and then reassembling you at the time it's sending you. And so each time you get translated or copied, more of your body is falling apart. And so like, it's a very interesting theory of time travel. It's much more of a realistic version than like, you can just jump back and forth, it's no biggie. It's like, there's real consequences to being sent. And a lot of the archaeologists who get sent, they didn't want to go in the first place. They're only going to rescue their friend who got sent by the Congress.
Yeah. How do they like ancient people see like modern technology or something like that?
So they had to hide all of their modern technology. Like they were wearing peasants' clothes and they were dressed like costumes essentially. Yes. Timeline. It's actually really interesting. It's an action film first and foremost. It's a really interesting take on time travel. I'd recommend it highly. Very good watch.
The movie in Parallel Universes is Parallels.
Parallels. I'm going to have to write that one down, but Timeline's worth it. And Timeline fits in our class because we talked about the 100 Years' War, so it's even better. Okay. So, get you. All right. How are you guys feeling? How are we doing?
Pretty okay.
Pretty okay? Thank you. Who asked that? What are you up to? What do you want?
What do you want?
What do you want?
You want a video game or something?
Yes. You always have an ulterior motive when I ask this question. All right. Let's go ahead and get going. I feel like we left off in a good spot. We had finished talking about the French colonial project, and we were now going to talk about what is obviously the big step next. We are going to talk about the first of our 5 big wars. You know, this class, like I said, even though we're obviously going to attempt to discuss things through the political, cultural, and social lens as we go, it's impossible to separate America's emergence from these 5 wars. This is the first one of them. This is a birth every damn time of the French and Indian War, also known as 7 Years War.
Honestly, the name 7 Years War sounds more traumatic.
Doesn't it? The irony is that it lasts more than 7 years. That's another one of those historical quirks. Yeah.
So would this have been one of the first times that these armies would have had to move, like for military campaign, like large military campaigns, their armies out of Europe?
Yes. This is the funny way to answer that. This will be the biggest commitment we see from the European powers in the New World. It isn't that they're not used to, at least by this point, colonial expeditions. In fact, the British have a very famous colonial expedition against Cartagena in the New World, which is a Spanish colony in the 1712-ish range, where like 30,000 British soldiers and sailors participate. Something like 10,000 died of disease. But all of these empires are used to it. Remember, we've had all these wars that we didn't really get too deep into that have a colonial component. This is simply the biggest one that outsizes all of them.
It's pretty much like the real First World War.
It is. Most historians now, especially military historians, agree. This is really the First World War. It's not labeled as such. It wasn't noticed as such at the time, but because of its colonial, the colonial wars in North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and India, it is very much a world war, not to mention all of the fighting in Europe that we'll get into. So let's get down to it. This is probably my favorite word to study. I think it is, in the end, one of the words that really shapes American identity. And obviously, we have to understand American identity if we're going to understand the United States and its military, because they very much come from one another. And obviously, this is the birth of what we would consider an American identity as opposed to a British identity in America. Make sense? So keep your eye on those things. And let's start back where you guys all recognize we should start. American settlement. One, we already know that westward expansion is the key driver of the English settlement patterns. And I'm going to switch from saying English to British. Just so you know, I'm now changing that. Why would I switch from English to British? What's happened? Great Britain has happened. What do I mean? Great Britain has happened.
Scotland and England Union.
What's that called?
Commonwealth.
You actually kind of just said it. It's the Union. The Act of Union. The most important of which is in 1707, but there's a variety of acts of union. So we can stop calling them the English and start calling them the British, because it now includes Scotland, Northern Ireland, obviously Wales from the get-go, but we now are starting to see what we call a British identity instead of English identity, as more English, or excuse me, as Scots and the Irish are brought into the English English system.
Does it include all of Ireland?
No, it technically does, as most of these English landlords own big chunks of Ireland, but they don't include the average poor Irishman is not considered anything other than a poor Irishman. Though plenty of poor Irishmen end up in English armies, they're never given the same get-go. Remember, Catholic Irish, still a problem for Protestant Englishmen who run things. Make sense? So, this right here is just a picture of some guys farming tobacco to remind you that in the end, the biggest issue and the real reason that the French and Indian War starts is that ever increasing need for land, particularly along the western border. Now, as we've already discussed, the kind of rolling problem that is English settlement is now beginning to run directly into the same French imperial pretensions coming down from where? Say the St. Lawrence River Valley, very good. From New France or Canada. We'll probably just call it Canada as a shorthand in this class. Those competing aims are the big issue. But obviously there's a third competing claim that's going to make this war so much longer and so much larger in scope. And that's what third group? The natives, particularly what confederacy? Very good. Iroquois Confederacy. In the end, Ohio is owned by neither the French nor the English. They both claim it, but neither of them owns it. And so, in the early 1750s, this man, governor of Virginia, begins to plot for the extension of Virginia's rights in the Ohio country, understanding, again, that this territory is actually owned by the Iroquois Confederacy. Despite the Iroquois Confederacy owning what is modern Ohio, there were very few natives living on it because the Iroquois used it as what? Any guesses?
Hunting ground.
Big hunting ground, very good. They used it something as a no man's land, is a better way to think of it. Because the Iroquois Confederacy, largely along the St. Lawrence River Valley, upstate New York, upstate Vermont, etc., this land was a large hunting territory and was part of their yearly campaigns against Cherokee and Creek tribes in the South. Remember what I said about the Morning Wars and how they were very cyclical? Every summer, Iroquois warriors, after the hunting season ended, traveled south and went to war with tribes in the South for the same reasons we talked about, those Morning Wars reasons, which were what?
Population.
Replacement of population. Cyclical combat, right? Every year they go out and they bring people back. Sometimes they lose people, and the next year they have to go back and revenge them. It's the same system over and over again. So this area is now contested by three big powers. And let's be clear, the Iroquois Confederacy at this time couldn't match the French or the English for numbers, but they certainly could in terms of military power. This is a very, very powerful military. Very powerful military.
Are there 5 nations or 6?
17, 21, 6 nations at this point. Yes.
So why didn't the British team up with the Cherokee or Creek?
They did. I'll talk about that in a bit. They will in the end try to. But
They're farther south, however.
they're much further south. And so most of the time, the British are much more happy that the Cherokee and the Creek aren't attacking them. And so they're much more intrigued by keeping them neutral in this conflict before they can take them into their side eventually. It's a great question. In the end, the reason they don't really too deeply ally with them is eventually they'd like to take their land as well, which they'll do in about 40 years during the Creek Wars. It's not just the British, it's kind of Europeans at this time are, kind of up to their own stuff. We know this now. So let's talk. Does anybody know who the governor of Virginia was at the time?
It's not Dinwiddie, is it?
Yeah, it is. This is Governor Dinwiddie. Very good. Governor Dinwiddie. Now, Dinwiddie is a bit of an interesting guy. Robert Dinwiddie is here your spelling. Dinwiddie is an interesting guy, but we don't really need to get too deeply into who he was as a person. We just need to understand that, like many royal governors, in this case, he is the governor of what state? Virginia, is eager to use his office for monetary gain. It was assumed at the time, we don't have to scoff too much, because it was assumed at the time these men would do that. Part of being appointed a governor of a far-off colony meant that sometimes it was seen as an exile, sometimes it was seen as a promotion, but everybody who was sent essentially was assumed that they needed to support their income, which was paid by the colonial assemblies, with side projects, so to speak. These men didn't come here just to be good politicians, they came here to make money too. Like many of these governors, Dinwiddie believed, for obvious reasons, that the best way for him to make a bunch of money would be to get into what business?
Land speculation?
Land speculation. Very good, John. Land speculation. He's a land speculator, like many others. And we've already talked about what the process of land speculation is, right? Generally, either the governor or whatever company is doing this buys big, big tracts of land, or at least buys the claim to big tracts of land, and then does what with it? Sells it to small settlers. So say, for instance, Dinwiddie wants to buy what we call the Ohio country. He does not plan on selling this to 1 or 2 people, does he? He plans on selling it to tens of thousands of settlers who are going to subdivide it and subdivide it. That's how land speculation works. If, for instance, it costs the government, this is my pound sign, it's terrible, I know, 200,000 pounds to buy Ohio, what do they hope to sell it as across the board?
10 times.
10 times that, right. They're looking to make a big, big amount of money down the road. So what does it mean in terms of who gets to be a land speculator? What do you have to have to begin with? Political connections and money. Very good. It takes political connections.
You run out of space there.
I run out of space everywhere. You'll find I'm pretty terrible at that. Political connections and money. Now, the money is necessary to buy the land up front. The political connections are necessary for what? Who gives these land grants? Who at least authorizes them? Probably somewhere, yes, probably somewhere back in, the British government does. Tells Dinwiddie, so to speak, sure, go investigate that, check on what we've got, buy it, start selling it. Now, it's done with permission from the English government, but obviously the English government is going to defer to who in terms of local expertise? Yeah, the governor. So it's kind of a self-dealing thing here. Dinwiddie's the guy who's making the reports the English government's reading, ergo, his reading of the local situation is going to be taken as what? Fact, more often than not. And this is why, for a lot of American history, these English governors wield a lot of power. Even though their colonial legislature can often fiddle with what they're doing, or at least tend to mess with them as they see fit on the local level, these governors have immense power because of their connection to the English monarchy back home. So, was there a question, Christian?
Yeah, so what type of people would be buying land that were to be a higher class or lower class?
What do you think?
Probably in the middle.
Somewhere in the middle. So it's not to say that it's only poor people moving west, but it's generally what we would call smallholders, people who are looking to buy, 50, 100 acres. We're not talking about big groups that buy the frontier territories. It's usually families who do it. But obviously, it takes a little bit of capital to buy this, right? You need to spend X number of pounds to buy the land. You have to be able to farm the land, which means you need the tools and the seed. It's not as easy as simply wandering out into the forest, right? It takes some money. So we're generally talking about yeoman farmers, the poor class that could afford at least the land.
Is that why they would be so militant whenever like natives and stuff would be like, it's our land, like, well, we just spent all of our,
That's exactly it. Is what we'll generally see is kind of a system that feeds into itself. As these settlers move west and push into land that doesn't belong to them, but only belongs to them because the Virginian government says so, what group is going to react negatively? The natives who actually own the land, which the natives who then react by killing settlement or destroying settlements and killing civilians that have moved illegally into their land, who do these civilians turn to? Back to the Virginian government for protection, which leads the Virginian government to dispatch what? Soldiers who then destroy the natives. It's kind of a cyclical pattern in which the constant press of who forces the issue. The settlers. Constant settlement is the problem. As long as the Americans push west, we're going to have a problem with natives, which means the rest of American history, which is the sea to shining sea movement, means who's going to continue to be displaced and attacked? The natives. Even if they react to it, they're going to be displaced and attacked because it's seen automatically as a provocation. We don't need to get too deeply into the problems of what is obviously going to be a major issue going forward, is these 13 different colonies with 13 different plans, 13 different interpretations of this Western settlement gets them in trouble with a much, much more organized New France and Canada, led by, as you guys can see, because I've mixed up my timing, is the Marquis up here, the Marquis de Vaudreuil. Now, Vaudreuil is the governor of Canada. He's the governor of New France. Unlike the Virginian governor, who holds essentially just local political power in Virginia, his is much more wide-ranging. The Governor General of France has a lot of roles and a lot of responsibilities. He's responsible for the Canadians, he's responsible for the Canadian militia, and more importantly, any regular regiments sent from France become part of his army as well. Virginians, for instance, if Virginia calls back to the English mother country for regiments, those troops don't show up and automatically belong to Dinwiddie. They belong to the English government. And so we generally will see is a French government a little bit more prepared and a little bit more ready for this war than the English who wander into it. So Dinwiddie has Dinwiddie has created what is called the, shockingly easy to remember, the Ohio Company, which at its heart is a joint stock company designed for land speculation. The goal of the Ohio Company and of Dinwiddie and its investors is to map out the Ohio country that they know belongs to the Iroquois for settlement. To do so, you needed to send someone who had the experience of surveying, probably belonged to the local military setup, the militia that we've talked about again and again, and had a knowledge of Virginian state politics. Generally, what we're talking about then is somebody who is good money Virginian, good blood, good name, and has the ability and interest to go into the back country for several months. Dinwiddie selects a young Virginian named George Washington, one of the most important dumbasses in American history, because there is no question that at this age, he was not ready for what was assigned to him.
How old were you?
He was, I think, 20 at this point, 20, 21. We're talking about a kid. They select a kid, essentially. One, despite who he will become at the time, is just a local planter's son. He comes from good money. He's a big, well-known address. Where does he live? Mount Vernon. He Plenty of slaves, plenty of land.
Oh,
He's a tall guy. He's a healthy guy. He's very interested in the militia. He's very interested in military arts. He's read a lot of books. He's never actually seen combat, but he's read a lot of books. That's the guy they pick. We'll talk about the momentous complications that brings in a minute, but there is no reason why Washington shouldn't have been picked. He was a good example of the young, land-hungry English elite who wanted to help the empire while also helping who? Themselves. Washington, like many others who had these jobs, saw it as both a private and empire venture.
You got
Private.
great experience though.
He got some sort of experience, I guess we'll say.
Kind of
Dramatic.
I'll let you decide how much he learned from
Oh,
that.
I've read a lot of Washington.
Well, it's very interesting. You come out of this with a positive opinion of him because his experience in the French and Indian War is what we might call.
He's my favorite founding father, without a doubt, no question. He's the best.
So basically what happened was.
We'll talk later.
We'll talk about.
I disrupted you.
Yeah, you're fine. Now I'm thinking of who my favorite founding father was.
He's my
James Madison.
Madison?
No,
I'm probably more
he's my
Jeffersonian.
second favorite.
Say
No, actually,
Jefferson.
mine's Alexander.
No.
Yeah, give it that. All right, so let's tell the story of Jumonville's Glen. Your all's next reading assignment. You guys are reading the Military Revolution right now. Yep, going well so far. I've already posted a discussion board for that. It's not due this Sunday, it's due next Sunday, so take some time, make good posts.
Waiting for what reading assignment?
The Military Revolution one.
Okay.
Is it like the first 20 pages or something like
It's only the first 20 or 30 pages. Read your syllabus before you read that 100-page document. It's only the first 30 pages or so.
Yeah.
Please pay attention to the reading
that?
lengths.
When you post it, it's just like, how does he expect?
No, I don't expect you to read 100 pages. I really don't.
Yeah.
You can always read more, but please just stick to the reading. So, the next reading assignment for you guys in this class, after you're done with the Military Revolution, is you're going to be reading a little bit of the very, very best work on the subject of the French and Indian War, which is Fred Anderson's Crucible of War. An absolutely fantastic book. If you've got the time, it's a nice 700-page read, but it is incredible.
Crucible of War.
Crucible of War. You're only reading the introduction in the first few pages to get the flavor of what happens here, but I'm going to tell you the story too. It's a good one. It's an interesting thought. So, let's do this. Here's what happens. George Washington leads a small group of militia and a small group of surveyors into the Ohio backcountry, doing his job, surveying the area, looking for what do land speculators look for when they're surveying? Water sources, rivers, arable farmland, mountains, etc. His job is essentially to do what? He's a surveyor. He's a glorified map maker. That's his job. It doesn't and shouldn't surprise you that almost everybody, if not everybody in his surveying team is also armed. Because A, they know they're not on land that belongs to them, and B, they're also at least partially or completely aware that what is also being conducted at the same time from the French side.
Reconnaissance.
A reconnaissance mission, not just looking for surveying, but looking for them specifically. They know Washington has been sent out, and there is a small detachment looking for him and his men to tell them what? GTFO. Essentially, this is land already claimed by the French and their native allies. The English have no business being here. Washington's party is illegal, and they should go. Now, before the French and the young ensign Jumonville can deliver this message, the two groups run into one another in what we call, or sometimes called, the Battle of Jumonville. Jumonville's, I'm losing each one of these. Glen, Glenn. What's a Glen?
Like a valley.
Like a valley. A battle is the wrong term for what happens here. It's more of an accidental ambush in that the English war party under Washington runs into a French war party under the young ensign Colon de Jumonville. And in the ensuing meeting, which is basically just the two sides firing at each other, who has the better of it? The British do. The British have snuck up essentially on this little French detachment who didn't know they were there, and Washington's first instinct was to tell his men to do what? Open fire.
Wasn't there a Native American involved that kind of of stuff them into it and kind of plan.
We'll talk about Tanagreeson in just a second, but Tanagreeson does not order the first firing. Washington does. Washington's mistake was that he probably should have talked to the French first, because the French were bearing a message of parley saying, we don't want to kill you, you just need to leave. By firing on them, he had now essentially broken what? Any peace between the two nations. The two nations were not at war at this point. Despite long-term issues with one another, despite a long-term strategic rivalry, they had not been at war with each other since what war ended? Anybody know? I mentioned it very briefly.
100 years.
The War of Austrian Success.
Yeah, you didn't. Yeah, you mentioned that very.
Very briefly. That one ends in 1745. So essentially, the two nations have been at peace. This is now 1754 for about a decade. Except for one young Virginian has just opened fire.
So were the French, were they also just militia, or were they?
A mixture. The French called their militia, their Canadian militia, either voyageurs or troops de la marine. They had a lot of names for their troops, but they were a mixture, just like, or of him, mostly militia. But there was, in Colon de Jumonville was an officer in the colonial Canadian militia, which was just a better version of most of the militias in the English colonies, because it was called that more often, essentially. Now, this is what, here, by the way, this is what your French militia would look like.
Oh.
Bottom left.
That is.
Here is a French officer. These are Canadians,
Okay.
Canadian colonials. For the same reason, let's see if I got a better picture. You have, in this case, George Washington and Virginian militia. These are not necessarily professional armies. In fact, they're not professional at all. They're really, if you think about it like an octopus with tentacles. These are the very, very, very tips of a very big military system. This is just at the very tip of it is obviously less dangerous to you than back towards the beak of an octopus, right?
Yeah.
And so both sides have sent militia. Both sides don't anticipate a conflict. These aren't regulars. These are not, for the English, this is not the Black Watch or the Scottish elite. This is not for the French, the units from Berry or the units from Languedoc. These are mostly provincials fighting at the very end of a tether of empire, right? In some ways, do these men really represent their empires?
No.
Washington's case is a little bit more murky. He represents more than anything himself, his state, and a company he works for. Jumonville is there on the orders of the French government. He's supposed to be there. The English, much more funky. So, in the end, Jumonville and his party are captured. Washington takes them captive. And while they're trying to figure out through interpreters, because Washington does not speak French, they're trying to figure out through interpreters what the hell just happened. In fact, Jumonville and his interpreter keep trying to say, we weren't here to fight. We were here to negotiate. Why did you shoot at us? In the end, it's going to be one of, I'm going to spell this so wrong. You'll see it spelled correctly in the reading later. Tanagreeson. It's better to remember Tanagreeson so I don't have to keep messing up his name as the half-king. Is a native ally of Washington's. He is a guide from Ohio Indians for Washington. He is there as Washington's guide. This is one of those moments in history where we often forget that there is a lot of agency in individual native actions in individual native nations. Tanagreeson, or the half-king, is not a king of anything. He is the leader of a small band of natives, and his belief is that the French government is not a natural ally of his band, particularly his band that now lives in Ohio. He is much more interested in an English alliance for what it can do for him and his small tribe. He has nothing to do with the wider French or British dispute than that. But he steps in a big way. Very famously, while Washington is trying to figure out how to read French in 5 minutes, he does what? He executes Jumonville. He takes his hatchet out, splits his head while Washington looks on horrified and washes his hands in the brain matter. And he says, "Ananto, you are not dead yet," which is the Indian word for the French king, basically saying, let's do this thing. Washington, 19-year-old, 20-year-old, your all's age, staring at this goes like,
Is this what this shit's about?
oh shit. He did not see that coming, to say the least.
Is
That
that
would
what
have
this shit's?
been absolutely electric to watch.
It's hard not to imagine the guy that will eventually become president of the United States not literally crapping himself when that happened.
Basically, it's
He
a-
didn't want to be in that fight. He didn't know it was coming. And Tom Greason decided, let's go all in.
What a wild card.
That's the
man.
fog of war right there.
That is the fog of war right there. And it's also a nice reminder that no matter how much the English and the French or any European power attempted to do what they wanted to the natives often had very different ideas of what needed to happen for them. And so in the end, the French and Indian War is going to be both the mistake of a young Virginian and the designs of a native completely divorced from these European realities. Make sense?
Welcome to the military, Washington.
So, Washington gets it even worse. It gets worse for our young friend. Because Washington does not realize that Jumonville's brother is marching up with a bigger French force. Ensign Jumonville was actually just the very, very tip, like I said, of the French expedition. And his brother comes up with several hundred more men, including French regulars. Washington realizes the game is up and attempts to retreat before he is trapped at a little fort he builds called, anybody know?
Fort Washington.
Yeah, he's not that crazy yet. Fort Necessity. You might guess the name also tells you the fort was a piece of crap. It was poorly sited because he wasn't a very good surveyor. I'm going to really rip on Washington. He's a fascinating guy, but military tactics were not his specialty. Military morale, military ability to keep his army together, we'll talk about that. Tactics, he was pretty much shit ass. We'll talk about New York and New Jersey.
This is early.
It's early, but we'll also talk about the New York and New Jersey campaigns.
That's where,
Well, I'll let you, you know what, I'll let you get to it when we get to it together. How about that?
The Delaware
George
Cross,
felt that was
pretty much.
Surprising a bunch of sleepy Hessians at Trenton was not much of a campaign. But
Genius.
we'll get there. Don't worry.
Basically,
We'll get there together.
Basically, Washington wasn't a screw up.
He wasn't necessarily a screw up. He just wasn't ready. I mean, part of the problem was, remember, none of these armies are professional armies except for the ones back in Europe. So his entire experience with European tactics was what before this?
Reading.
Maybe reading it out of a book. We know Washington may have read at least one tactical manual. He had never seen combat. All of this was a shock of war in a lot of ways. He probably was in shock.
It's like Call of Duty players getting thrown into Normandy.
Yes, all of a sudden I understand tactics at a deep level because I, watched Gods and Generals once. It doesn't work that way, right? There's a lot more to it. Remember how we talked about the difference between military enthusiasts and military theorists? There's a huge gulf, right? So, to continue, Jumonville's brother, as you might expect when he captures Washington at his leaky little fort, Fort Necessity, leaking by quite literally because it has rained so badly, he's not in the best mood, and he's certainly not happy with Washington. And the problems with translation continue, because Washington is handed by Jumonville a letter, basically saying in French, I take responsibility for the murder, not the military defeat of, the murder of Jumonville. I am responsible for the fact that the British are illegally in Ohio, and I renounce all territorial rights to the Ohio country. Washington signs the document without any real understanding of what it says, because the French tell him they'll do what with him if he doesn't.
Kill him.
He's pretty sure they'll kill him. In the end, though, they offer him what if he signs the document? It's a pretty common thing at the time.
Think so?
Parole. Generally, these nations had a hard enough time feeding their own population, much less hundreds or thousands of prisoners of war. So we'll kind of talk about this regularly. Captured armies are not often sent to prison camps. They're sent where? Go home. You just have to sign a piece of paper saying you won't participate in the next campaign or the next 2 years. And remember, these guys definitely still see themselves as the inheritors of that honor system that dates all the way back to the knights themselves. So many of these men believed it would be against their honor to participate later. That's why they sign these things. Washington sits out the next year until the English begin to prepare again for another campaign. So now we got a problem, a huge problem, because the British and French are not at war. But this document makes its way back to both Paris and London. It could not have looked good for young George Washington. The very first time he's mentioned at royal court is this dumb mother screwed everything up and is now given the French what? What do we call what they've given the French? We heard this term before in Latin. Let's get this term down. Casus belli. Anybody? Latin?
Where'd you write that? Cause for war.
Cause for war. Very good. Casus belli. That is a reason for a legitimate war. The French literally have a document signed by a Virginian gentleman saying, my bad.
Hey, I killed your dude.
I killed your dude. It was probably murder. I really didn't have any control of the situation. I take full responsibility. In the European parlance, the French couldn't get a better opportunity to tell the whole world, look at how awful the English are. Both courts, though, both courts decide, do we want to start this or not? Because after all, they'd only been at peace for about 9 years, or about 11 years at this point. The French government, to say that the French government's finances were rickety, is to put it nicely. The French government is already starting to feel that pinch that will eventually lead to what?
French Revolution.
French Revolution. Directly from this war, the American Revolution's costs to the French Revolution. The French, and one of the French ministers in charge of finance tells the king, don't do it. We're going to go broke. But the issues are too big. Just because Washington has touched it off doesn't mean the French and the English are any less interested in the Ohio country. If anything, what's it really said to the French government?
Willing to fight for it.
The English are already sending war parties into the Ohio. Whether we want to fight this or not, what's happening? We're going to get there. We might as well do it when we have a clear what? A clear moral superiority. That's what the French saw in Washington's mistake. That's what the English saw too. But did the English castigate Washington? Does he get a note back from the English government, from the king saying, bad boy?
No.
No.
He gets rewarded.
He doesn't just get rewarded. The English decide that they want to support the Virginian decision, and so they begin to form an expedition to Ohio. Probably one of the most well-known and important expeditions in American history. We're going to get into it later. Led by Edward Braddock. It is the first of our case study battles that we'll examine in this class, the Battle of the Monongahela. But before we get too far into that, we need to understand what's changing and what already has changed in European warfare so that you can see the difference quite literally between the militia that exists in the colonies and the armies, the professional armies back in Europe. We call this era, ironically enough, the Age of Reason. The Age of Reason is simply the shorthand of the post-Enlightenment era. This is the era of Camus, this is the era of Voltaire, John Locke, Adam Smith. This is the flowering of European intellectual dominance. It's also a time that now that we're basically 100 years, give or take, from the end of the 30 Years' War, what was the one thing I told you the Europeans were very determined to do about warfare?
Limit it.
Make it limited. This is also sometimes called the era of limited war. We talked about the horrors of the 30 Years' War and how they, in the end, really make the European leadership, or at least the European lords, military class, recoil from the horrors that they inflicted on the populations. And so their response to that was to create a system that both made it easier for them to control their armies, because in the end, it's the armies and the foot soldiers who often are the ones who went off and marauded, killed, murdered, and raped as they saw fit during the 30 Years' War, but also give them greater control over winning battles. This is the era in which we begin to see the reforms of guys like Gustavus Adolphus and Maurice of Nassau, who I mentioned as reformers, get used much, much more broadly. All of the European states by the mid-1700s had the same technology, the same tactics, and the same theory. They were all working from the same blueprint, every one of them. Here is the technology. At this point, the pike has disappeared. We're no longer in the age of pike and shot. Every infantryman carries what? A flintlock musket. Now, a flintlock musket is some of the most notoriously, laughably short-ranged weapons in history. Its effective range was probably something in the neighborhood of 100 yards. Its maximum range was probably somewhere between 200 to 300 yards, but at that point you might as well have just been throwing tennis balls at each other for all of its ability to kill you. These guns were very, very simple. Loading and learning to fire them quickly was not. Does anybody know how a flintlock works? This is a flintlock. As you can see, there's a little bit of flint. Flint is what?
It's a piece of stone that creates a spark.
Yeah, it's a sparking stone. These guns then had long barrels. You ram a ball and a little bit of powder down the barrel. Quite shove it down with a ramrod is the piece that runs long. Push it down. Then you pull back the flint piece in the pan right here. There's a little pan about this big. You pour a little bit more gunpowder. Get ready. And when you pull the trigger, the flint banks off the metal piece here, creates a spark, which then ignites the powder and shoots the bullet. That's a process, just to say, right? Depending on which military manual you use at the time, it could take up to 60 different steps to march through these gun manuals. Yeah.
Was the flintlock musket, did it have a longer or shorter effective range of the gun that was used with the pike and shot?
Longer than the matchlock. Good question. A matchlock, the biggest problem with the matchlock is there was no flint piece here. Instead, you had to keep a lighted match constantly with you, because what it did is it rotated the same powder thing. Was just much more dangerous to walk around with. Nobody wants to walk around with like a lighted match constantly. In fact, if you see old bandoliers from the time, part of the reason the pirates were so fond of it in battle was you often had pieces of what do you call it? Match powder coming off you. And so these men would wrap the matches around their arms to keep them close, would light it, and then throughout the battle, would kind of do one of these to light it. There's a famous pirate, I'm sure you guys have all heard Blackbeard, right? Yeah. Blackbeard was famous for simply stuffing those into his beard, so that when he would jump on board another ship, he's freaking smoking, and he's got a gun in one hand and a sword in the other. Could you imagine anything more terrifying than a dude with like snakes pouring out of it, like fiery snakes pouring out of his beard?
This dude's crazy, we gotta go.
Anyways, to come back to it, the flintlock required a couple of things for it to be useful. As you might expect, given that its effective range was so short, what did you know probably didn't exist at the time?
Scopes.
There's no need for a scope. There's not even a need for the guys who usually use scopes. No such thing as a sniper at this period, right? The only way these things worked is if you put a bunch of them in a row, as close together as possible, and fire volleys. This is the age of, and this is a term you will need to know, linear warfare. Obviously, the big takeaway from that word is the use of the word line. Linear warfare. You'll read John Lynn's chapter on it. It's an excellent explainer of it as we go forward. All of the armies of Europe understood then that for them to kill each other and for them to make the flintlock work meant that you had to get a bunch of guys in line. Now, as you might expect, at 100 yards, 2 lines of troops like that, getting close was murderous. I mean, simply being able to keep men in the line was tough enough without having to worry about the fact that once you add on the fact that it's not just infantry, Infantry carry your flintlocks and form your battle lines, but you also have what? Bayonets to ward off who? Cavalry, remember. The reason that matchlocks had to go with men with pikes is because it took so long to reload the matchlocks and they couldn't protect themselves. Now, the matchlock, which is now a flintlock musket, has been combined with a bayonet. And the bayonet now serves as the individual infantryman's pike. Essentially, every man has become half pikeman, half flintlock gunman. Make sense?
Oh, that's really, it's a murderous combination.
But it's a natural combination,
Well, yeah.
right? So, once you combine these two, every infantryman is theoretically can face off cavalry. Now, cavalry at the time, depending on who you ask and which army you pick from, was either to be used for charging enemy lines with a broadsword or using a gun to fire at them in retreat. We don't need to get into the different types of cavalry unless you're wildly interested in doing so. But for now, suffice to say, infantry cannot defeat cavalry unless it has bayonets. And then, of course, there's the one way to break infantry, which is artillery. Artillery here, you can see, big, ponderous pieces of equipment that were expensive to maintain and keep. The artillery of the time was obviously used not just in siege warfare, but to bombard infantry formations because they were essentially flintlock guns on a much larger scale, firing big cannonballs that rip through these ranks like you would essentially rip through paper. I mean, it's very, very ugly business, this war.
Since it took so long to reload, did they often just resort to beating each other to death with the butts of their rifles?
Generally, when these two sides came at each other, for the first thing was first, is you fired a line, you fired your shot, and then you went in with the bayonets. Most of these battles during this war were decided with a bayonet because loading took so long. When you were loading a flintlock, does anybody know how often generally you could load per minute? You're really working at it and you're really well trained.
Probably once or twice.
Generally, the average of a moderately trained soldier was twice a minute. That's pretty slow. The Prussians, who are absolutely, as you might expect, given their Germanness, were pretty wild about training their infantry, could fire 4 times a minute. And they were generally seen as the best of the best of the best. And even they could only manage 4 times a minute.
Was there still a social dynamic to the positions in the military?
Yes, so it's a great question. Who is your average infantryman? A commoner. We'll talk a lot in this class about the social dynamics of these units once we get more into things. The cavalry was then full of who? Still the nobility, generally. Even the second sons and third sons generally served in the cavalry because, to be clear, if you were a cavalryman, what did you have to pay for? The horse. That's a big social separator still at the time. Artillery is a bit of an oddity. Artillery is what we might consider the only part of these 3 things that was ever professionalized quickly. Generally, it was some sort of either professional and therefore paid for units that served in the artillery, or often scientists who served in the artillery because that was one of their natural outlets during wartime for their practices. In fact, going all the way back to the 100 Years' War, the most famous brothers who served in the artillery, the Bureau brothers, were actually mathematicians and scientists before they got into the artillery. Does that make sense? Yeah. So, it's good that, well, we'll stop there, pick back up on the Age of Reason on Friday, then we'll get into the French and Indian War. Any questions? Christian?
Do you think warfare is art or science?
Okay. So, I forgot I was going to answer that question today. On Friday, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little